Welcome to the Galactic Academy, where the brightest minds from across 17 star systems gather to learn about the wonders of interspecies biology. And by wonders, I mean the terrifying ways that evolution has equipped various creatures to murder each other in increasingly creative fashions. Professor Velkoth stood at the front of Lecture Hall Omega 7, his 8 tentacles arranging holographic displays with the kind of theatrical flourish that only comes from decades of academic superiority. The Zephyrin was widely considered the galaxy's foremost expert on dangerous xenofauna, which basically meant he had a PhD in things that will absolutely ruin your day if you meet them in a dark alley. His class was the stuff of legend. Students from the Crystalline Consortium would spend their entire trust funds just to audit his courses. The insectoid hive minds would literally split off specialized thinking drones to attend his lectures. Even the notoriously arrogant plasma beings would occasionally lower themselves to sit through one of his presentations, though they insisted on hovering 3 feet above everyone else because apparently sitting in chairs was beneath their energy-based dignity. Today's roster was particularly impressive. There was Zix, a 6-legged arachnoid whose species had evolved from apex predators and still retained an unfortunate tendency to view everything smaller than them as potential prey. Next to her sat Gornax, a crystalline entity whose homeworld had gravity roughly equivalent to being at the bottom of a gas giant, making him effectively a living tank. Behind them lurked Whisper, whose species name was literally unpronounceable by most vocal cords, and who communicated primarily through pheromone clouds that made everyone else slightly nauseous. And then there was Jake Murphy. Jake was the Academy's first human exchange student, a development that had caused roughly 6 months of bureaucratic panic when his application arrived. See, humans had only recently made contact with the galactic community, and their homeworld, Earth, had immediately been classified as a Class 12 Deathworld. This put it in the same category as planets where it rained sulfuric acid, and the local wildlife included things like molecular dissolution worms. The fact that humans had not only survived but actually thrived on such a nightmare planet had made them something of a curiosity. Most species evolved on nice, sensible worlds where the biggest environmental challenge was perhaps a seasonal pollen bloom or the occasional meteor shower. Earth, meanwhile, was apparently a planet where the weather could literally freeze you solid or cook you alive, sometimes in the same day, and where the native species included creatures that could bite through steel and others that were basically living nightmares with too many teeth. Jake, however, looked about as dangerous as a particularly non-threatening houseplant. He was average height for a human, which made him slightly short by galactic standards, with brown hair that stuck up in directions that suggested a casual relationship with grooming standards. He wore the Academy's standard-issue jumpsuit, except he had somehow acquired what appeared to be a beverage container covered in symbols from his homeworld that read, "World's Okayest Student." "Now then," Professor Velkoth began, his voice carrying that particular tone of academic authority that suggested he was about to impart wisdom that lesser minds could barely comprehend. "Today we begin our study of apex predators from Class 10 and above worlds. These specimens represent millions of years of evolutionary refinement toward one singular purpose." He paused dramatically. "Perfect lethality." Jake raised his hand. "Quick question, Professor. Do you guys have coffee in the cafeteria? Because I checked this morning, and there was just this purple stuff that smelled like industrial cleaner, and honestly, I'm not sure I can handle apex predators without at least 2 cups of caffeine." The silence that followed was the kind of profound quiet usually reserved for moments when someone accidentally insults a deity or asks a particularly stupid question during a funeral. Velkoth's tentacles twitched in what his students had learned to recognize as barely contained irritation. "Mr. Murphy, perhaps you could focus on the lesson at hand rather than your primitive nutritional requirements." "Right, sorry," Jake said, settling back in his chair with a grin. "Apex predators. Got it. Should be fun." If the rest of the class had possessed a collective consciousness, they would have shared the exact same thought at that moment. When a human from a Class 12 Deathworld says something should be fun, the universe tends to prepare for chaos. Velkoth's tentacles rippled in that particular way that suggested he was about to do something that would either cement his reputation as the galaxy's greatest xenobiologist, or result in a very awkward conversation with the Academy's insurance department. Possibly both. "Today," he announced, manipulating the room's environmental controls with practiced ease, "we have the extraordinary privilege of observing a specimen that has never before been studied in a controlled academic setting." The lighting dimmed to what most species considered ominously dramatic, but which humans would probably describe as nice mood lighting for a dinner date. A containment field shimmered to life in the center of the room, roughly the size of a small shuttle bay. Within its translucent barriers, something began to materialize as the teleportation sequence completed. The first thing that became apparent was the size. The creature stood nearly 8 feet tall at the shoulder, which already put it in the probably not suitable for apartment living category. Its body was sleek and predatory, covered in what appeared to be living shadow that shifted and moved independent of the creature's movements. 6 limbs extended from its torso, 4 legs that ended in claws the size of dinner plates, and 2 arm-like appendages that terminated in appendages that weren't quite hands and weren't quite additional claws, but managed to suggest they could probably open doors right before they opened you. Its head was the stuff of nightmares that nightmares had when they wanted to scare themselves. Elongated and angular, it featured not 1 but 3 sets of eyes, arranged in a pattern that suggested it had evolved to track multiple prey items simultaneously. The mouth, when it opened to taste the air, revealed several rows of crystalline teeth that looked like they had been specifically designed by a committee of sadists with engineering degrees. But the really unsettling part was how it moved. The creature didn't just walk, it flowed, like liquid death with a subscription to a premium gym membership. Every movement was perfectly calculated, economical, and suggested that it was constantly evaluating everything in its environment for potential threat level and nutritional value. The class reacted with the kind of immediate, visceral terror that suggested their various evolutionary paths had all included at least one chapter on things that will absolutely eat you. Zik's natural predatory instincts kicked in, but in reverse, causing her to frantically back away until she bumped into the wall. Gornax, despite being essentially a living boulder, began emanating stress frequencies that made the room's crystal fixtures hum nervously. Whisper's pheromone output shifted to what could only be described as existential dread with hints of vanilla. Emergency protocols activated automatically. Blast shields began sliding down over the windows. Security drones descended from hidden compartments in the ceiling. Somewhere in the distance, an alarm began playing what sounded like a funeral dirge composed specifically for academic institutions. "Behold," Velkoth declared with the kind of pride usually reserved for parents whose children had just graduated summa cum laude from Murder University. "A Raxonian Voidstalker, apex predator of Raxon 7. A Class 15 Deathworld where the local bacteria are considered a galactic health hazard." The creature's 3 sets of eyes swept across the terrified students, pausing momentarily on each one, as if filing them away in some cosmic recipe book. When its gaze fell on Jake, however, something interesting happened. Jake leaned forward in his seat, hands clasped together, wearing the expression of someone who had just spotted something genuinely delightful. "Oh, cool," he said, his voice cutting through the ambient terror like a knife through butter. "It's like a space tiger. Does it purr?" The silence that followed was so complete that you could have heard a pin drop, assuming pins existed in a universe where everyone was too terrified to manufacture small metal objects, because they might attract the attention of creatures like the one currently eyeing them for snack potential. Velkoth's tentacles began what could only be described as stress-braiding themselves. "Mr. Murphy, that creature has been responsible for the extinction of no fewer than 12 sentient species. It is not, in any conceivable universe, comparable to your primitive feline companions." "I don't know," Jake mused, tilting his head as he studied the Voidstalker with the casual interest of someone browsing pets at an adoption center. "Look at those eyes, classic predator intelligence, and see how it's testing the air? Definitely got that cat curiosity thing going on." He paused. "Plus, I bet if you knew where to scratch, it would totally love you forever." At this point, several students began questioning not just human survival instincts, but the fundamental nature of evolution itself. What happened next would later be studied in xenopsychology textbooks under the chapter titled "Why Humans Shouldn't Exist But Do Anyway." Jake stood up from his desk with the casual confidence of someone who had clearly never read a single galactic safety manual. The motion caused approximately half the class to emit sounds that their respective species made when confronted with imminent doom. Zix actually started molting stress scales, which was apparently a thing that happened when arachnoids witnessed something so fundamentally wrong with the universe that their exoskeletons gave up trying to protect them. "Mr. Murphy," Velkoth's voice climbed several octaves, which was impressive, considering he started with 8 vocal cords. "Please return to your seat immediately. That creature can sense fear, and movement will trigger its hunting instincts." "Actually," Jake said, walking slowly toward the containment field with his hands in his pockets like he was strolling through a park, "that's exactly backwards. See, predators like this don't hunt things that aren't afraid of them. Fear triggers prey behavior, which triggers predator response. Basic animal psychology." The Voidstalker had indeed noticed Jake's approach. Its 3 sets of eyes focused on him, with the kind of attention usually reserved for final exams or tax audits. What was particularly unsettling was that it had stopped its previous restless pacing and was now sitting perfectly still, which somehow managed to be more terrifying than when it was actively moving. Furthermore, Jake continued conversationally, as if he wasn't currently volunteering to become the galaxy's most expensive chew toy. Look at its posture. Classic feline body language. See how the ears are forward, not back. Forward ears mean curiosity, not aggression. If it wanted to kill something, those ears would be flat against its head. Gornax, whose crystalline structure was now emanating stress fractals that cast rainbow panic patterns across the walls, managed to vocalize through his species' harmonic communication method. Human Jake, your species designation suggests you should possess survival instincts. Please engage them immediately. Oh, I am, Jake replied cheerfully. He had reached the containment field and was now standing close enough that if the barrier failed, the Voidstalker could probably high-five him into several pieces. See, here's the thing about apex predators from harsh environments. They're not actually mindless killing machines. They're incredibly intelligent problem solvers who have to make complex decisions about energy expenditure versus caloric gain. The creature had tilted its head slightly, which Jake seemed to interpret as a positive sign, but which made everyone else consider updating their emergency contact information. Right now, Jake continued, beginning to make soft clicking sounds with his tongue, this guy's trying to figure out what I am. I'm not running, so I'm not prey. I'm not challenging him, so I'm not a threat. I'm not showing submission, so I'm not pack. I'm just being curious about him while he's being curious about me. The clicking sounds Jake was making were apparently similar to something the Voidstalker recognized, because its ears perked up even further. One of its not-quite hands pressed against the containment field from the inside, directly opposite where Jake was standing. Fascinating, Jake murmured, pressing his own hand against the field, so that only the energy barrier separated his palm from claws that could probably cut through starship hull plating. Look at that. Classic mirroring behavior. He's trying to understand me just as much as I'm trying to understand him. Professor Velkoth was now making sounds that his species typically reserved for religious ceremonies or complete mental breakdowns. That creature has eliminated entire planetary defense forces, he managed to squeak. Sure, Jake agreed readily, but probably because they shot at it first. I mean, if someone teleported me into a strange place full of weird-looking creatures who immediately started pointing weapons at me, I'd probably get a bit defensive too. The Voidstalker had begun making a low, rumbling sound that vibrated through the containment field. According to every piece of scientific literature in the galactic database, this sound was the last thing approximately 47,000 sentient beings had ever heard. Jake's face lit up like he'd just discovered birthday cake. Oh my god, he is purring! I knew it! You're just a big scary kitty, aren't you, buddy? The rumbling intensified. Whisper's pheromone output now smelled like the concept of panic had learned to be anxious about itself. Through the chemical cloud of terror, they managed to communicate their thoughts on the situation, which roughly translated to, the human has broken reality and we are all going to die because he thinks the galaxy's most efficient killer is adorable. This is absolutely impossible, Velkoth declared, all 8 tentacles now flailing in what appeared to be an academic version of a panic attack. Voidstalkers do not purr. They do not show affection. They certainly do not engage in interspecies bonding behavior with prey animals. Well, Jake said reasonably, still maintaining his position directly in front of what was essentially a mobile extinction event. Maybe nobody ever tried just being nice to one before. The creature pressed both of its not-quite hands against the containment field and leaned its massive head forward until its forehead was touching the energy barrier directly in front of Jake's face. The purring sound had become loud enough to make the floor vibrate. Yeah, Jake grinned. Definitely just a big kitty. I bet if this field wasn't here, you'd totally let me scratch behind those ears, wouldn't you? As if in response, the Voidstalker's tail, which had been lashing dangerously throughout the entire encounter, began moving in a slow, rhythmic pattern that bore an unmistakable resemblance to what humans called happy cat tail. The collective realization that swept through the classroom at that moment was roughly equivalent to discovering that the monster under your bed just wanted someone to read it bedtime stories. Jake, being human and therefore genetically predisposed to poking things he probably shouldn't poke, had begun examining the containment field controls, with the intense focus of someone who had definitely not read the 17-page safety manual that came with the equipment. So these settings, he mused aloud, running his finger along the holographic interface. They're basically just adjusting the field density, right? Like a volume knob, but for energy barriers that keep horrible death at bay? "Do not touch those controls," Velkuth shrieked, with the sort of voice that suggested his vocal cords had just filed for hazard pay. "Those systems require a Class 7 certification and 3 years of specialized training to operate safely." "Relax, Professor," Jake said, completely ignoring the advice with the cheerful confidence that had probably gotten his species through several extinction-level events. "I'm just curious about the interface design. Pretty intuitive, actually. Very user-friendly for something designed to contain galactic nightmares." The Voidstalker, meanwhile, was now pressing its entire body against the containment field, still making that rumbling purr sound that was causing the room's acoustic dampeners to file noise complaints. Its eyes remained locked on Jake, with what could generously be called intense interest, or less generously be called the look a starving person gives a perfectly cooked meal. "Interesting," Jake observed, studying the creature's posture with the analytical attention of someone who had clearly spent way too much time watching nature documentaries. "See how it's angling its body? Classic submission display. It's showing me its flank, which is basically the universal mammalian way of saying, 'I trust you not to murder me.' That's actually pretty sophisticated social behavior for something everyone thinks is just a mindless killing machine." Zix had backed so far away from the containment field that she was now essentially trying to phase through the wall behind her. "Human Jake," she chittered nervously. "Perhaps your species' pattern recognition is malfunctioning. That creature is displaying hunting preparation, not submission." "Nah," Jake waved dismissively. "Trust me on this one. I grew up on a farm. You learn to read animal body language pretty quick when your daily routine involves feeding things that could kick you into next week if they felt like it." He paused, considering. "Actually, our cows were probably about as dangerous as this guy, just in different ways." This statement caused Whisper to release a pheromone burst that roughly translated to, "The human just compared a galaxy-ending apex predator to livestock, and I think my understanding of reality is dissolving." Jake was now examining the containment field controls with the sort of focused attention that suggested he was definitely about to do something that would make excellent material for either a scientific breakthrough or a very colorful obituary. "You know what I'm curious about? This field is set to maximum containment, but look at the power consumption readings. This thing is drawing enough energy to power a small space station. Seems like overkill for behavioral observation." "Mr. Murphy," Velkuth's voice had taken on the pleading quality usually reserved for hostage negotiations, "please step away from the controls before you accidentally commit genocide." "I'm not going to commit genocide," Jake protested. "I'm just going to lower the field strength a little. Look, the creature wants to interact, and we can't learn anything meaningful about its behavior while it's basically in solitary confinement." His finger hovered over what was clearly labeled as the field intensity control. "Besides, what's the worst that could happen?" In the history of galactic civilization, those 6 words had preceded approximately 93% of all major disasters, 78% of diplomatic incidents, and 100% of the events that resulted in new safety regulations being written, in the blood of people who should have known better. Jake reduced the field strength by exactly 15%. The change was immediate and catastrophic. The containment barrier shifted from opaque energy wall to something more like a very thick window, and the Voidstalker's response was to place both not-quite hands against the barrier and push. The field, designed to contain a creature at maximum aggression levels, was suddenly being tested by that same creature operating at a much more focused and intelligent level. The barrier held, but just barely, and the power consumption readings began climbing toward numbers that made the room's computer systems start composing their own last words. "Field integrity at 68% and falling," announced the room's computer, in the sort of calm, professional voice that artificial intelligences used when they wanted everyone to know they weren't paid enough to deal with this nonsense. "Evacuation protocol, Alpha Patag Head," Velkuth screamed, which was the galactic academic equivalent of shouting every sentient being for themselves. The class erupted into chaos. Gornax simply smashed through the wall behind him, apparently deciding that structural damage was preferable to staying in the same room as whatever was about to happen. Zix began climbing the walls in the literal sense, using her natural arachnid abilities to reach the ceiling, where she hung like a terrified chandelier. Whisper had released so many panic pheromones that the room's air recycling system gave up and just started playing relaxing music instead. Field integrity at 42%. And then Jake did something that would be talked about in xenobiology circles for the next 3 centuries. Instead of running, instead of screaming, instead of doing any of the things that billions of years of evolution had specifically designed intelligent creatures to do when faced with imminent death, he stepped closer to the failing containment field. "Hey there, big guy," he said softly, reaching out toward the barrier. "It's okay. Nobody's going to hurt you here." The Void Stalker stopped pushing against the field. Its 3 sets of eyes focused on Jake with laser intensity, and for a moment, that lasted approximately forever, Predator and human regarded each other across a barrier that was failing at a rate that made the room's insurance premiums spontaneously increase. Field integrity at 15%. Containment failure imminent. The barrier flickered once, twice, and then died completely. The Raxonian Voidstalker, apex predator of a world where the local wildlife included things that made nightmares wake up screaming, stepped delicately out of its containment area and sat down directly in front of Jake Murphy like the universe's most dangerous house cat waiting for dinner. Jake reached out slowly and scratched it behind what he had correctly identified as its ears. The purring sound that resulted was loud enough to shake dust from the ceiling tiles and probably registered on seismic equipment in the next solar system. The creature's eyes closed in what could only be described as absolute bliss, and its tail began moving in the slow, hypnotic pattern that every human in the galaxy would immediately recognize as happy cat tail, but scaled up for industrial applications. "Good kitty," Jake murmured, scratching more confidently now. "Who's a good space kitty? Yes, you are. Yes, you are." From her position on the ceiling, Zix managed to whisper what everyone was thinking. The human has either achieved the impossible, or is about to become the galaxy's most expensive pet food. As if in response, the Void Stalker flopped onto its side with a thud that made the entire building shake, exposing its belly in the universal sign of trust that transcended species barriers. Jake grinned and obligingly provided belly rubs to a creature that had previously been considered unsuitable for anything except starring in other species' worst nightmares. The sound of Jake scratching the Voidstalker's belly was reminiscent of someone polishing a very large, very content motorcycle engine. The creature had rolled completely onto its back, all 6 limbs flopping in different directions in a display of vulnerability that would have made military strategists across the galaxy weep into their tactical manuals. "Okay, gather round everyone," Jake announced cheerfully, as if he wasn't currently using a galactic apex predator as a demonstration model. "Since Professor Velkoth seems to be having some kind of existential crisis over there, let me explain what's actually happening here." Velkoth was indeed experiencing what could charitably be called an academic meltdown. All 8 of his tentacles had gone completely limp, and he was staring at the scene before him with the expression of someone whose entire worldview had just been fed through a paper shredder. Twice. "First lesson," Jake continued, giving the Voidstalker's belly another enthusiastic scratch that produced purring loud enough to set off car alarms in neighboring star systems, "is about pack hierarchy. This guy isn't actually a mindless killer. He's a social predator, which means he operates on pack dynamics." Zix, still clinging to the ceiling like a very nervous spider, managed to chitter out a response. "But the research clearly indicates that Raxonian Voidstalkers are solitary hunters with no pack structure whatsoever." "Right," Jake nodded, "because every time anyone's encountered one, they've immediately started shooting at it. Kind of hard to observe natural social behavior when your first interaction is attempted murder." He gestured to the creature, who was now making happy little churring sounds that no scientific database had ever recorded. "See, what happened here is I established myself as neither threat nor prey. I became what animal behaviorists called a neutral presence. And since he's clearly an intelligent creature who's probably been lonely as hell, he decided I might be interesting company." The Voidstalker had begun nuzzling Jake's shoulder with the sort of affection usually reserved for reunions between long-lost family members, if long-lost family members typically possessed enough raw physical power to accidentally demolish small buildings. "Second lesson," Jake continued, now scratching under what appeared to be the creature's chin while it made sounds of contentment that were causing the room's structural supports to harmonize, "is about environmental psychology. This poor guy has been stuck in maximum security containment since he got here. Imagine being trapped in a white box with no stimulation, no interaction, no mental enrichment. That's enough to make anyone a little cranky." Gornax had managed to extract himself from the wall he'd smashed through and was now observing the scene from what he considered a safe distance, which was roughly equivalent to the next county. "Human Jake," his harmonic voice trembled with crystalline confusion, "are you suggesting that the galaxy's most feared predator was simply suffering from inadequate mental stimulation?" "Exactly," Jake beamed, as if Gornax had just correctly answered a particularly tricky quiz question. "Look at him now. Classic signs of an intelligent predator receiving appropriate social interaction. The purring, the physical contact seeking, the way he keeps checking to make sure I'm still here." The Voidstalker had indeed been periodically opening one eye to verify that Jake hadn't disappeared, then closing it again with obvious satisfaction. Third lesson, Jake continued, apparently warming to his impromptu lecture, is about interspecies communication. Every intelligent species has some form of social bonding behavior. For humans, it's often physical contact combined with vocal reassurance. Apparently, for Voidstalkers, it's pretty similar. As if to prove his point, the creature rolled slightly to one side and presented its head to Jake in the unmistakable gesture of, "Please provide additional head scratches immediately." Jake obliged, and the resulting purr was powerful enough to make the lights flicker. It was at this moment that the Academy's emergency response team arrived in full tactical gear, weapons charged and ready to deal with what their sensors had reported as a catastrophic containment failure, with multiple casualties probable. The team leader, Commander Thex, was a battle-scarred veteran whose species had evolved from military engineers and who approached every problem with the assumption that it could be solved through the judicious application of overwhelming firepower. He burst through the classroom door expecting to find carnage, chaos, and possibly some light genocide. Instead, he found Jake Murphy giving belly rubs to a creature that was making sounds of happiness so pure that several team members immediately began questioning their career choices. "What?" Commander Thex said slowly, his weapons automatically targeting the Voidstalker before his brain caught up with what his eyes were seeing. "In the name of all 17 Chaos Gods is happening here?" "Oh hey!" Jake looked up from where he was now scratching behind the creature's ears, causing its back leg to kick involuntarily in that way that every human would immediately recognize as the galactic equivalent of a dog's scratch reflex. "Perfect timing. I was just explaining to the class how most dangerous predators are actually just misunderstood creatures who need proper social interaction." The Voidstalker opened one eye, noticed the armed response team, and made a sound that was clearly a question directed at Jake. It was the sort of sound that roughly translated to, "Are these new friends, or should I be concerned about them?" "It's okay, buddy," Jake assured the creature, continuing his scratching routine. "They're just here to help. Nobody's going to hurt you." The creature's tail continued its happy swishing pattern, and it settled more comfortably against Jake's legs like the universe's most deadly lapcat. Commander Thex lowered his weapons slowly, not because tactical protocol suggested it was safe, but because his brain had simply given up trying to process a situation where a human was using an extinction-level threat as an oversized therapy animal. "Student Murphy," he said carefully, "are you aware that you're currently cuddling with something that could theoretically eat this entire space station?" "Sure," Jake shrugged. "But he's not going to, are you, big guy?" The creature responded by rolling over again to demand more belly rubs, apparently having decided that Jake was the best thing to happen to it since the invention of prey animals. Professor Velkelth finally managed to reboot his higher brain functions and approached the scene with the sort of cautious fascination usually reserved for watching supernovas from a safe distance. "This is scientifically impossible," he muttered, extending one tentacle toward the creature. "Everything we know about Voidstalker psychology indicates they cannot form bonds with non-Raxonian species." The Voidstalker noticed Velkoth's approach and made an inquiring sound at Jake, clearly asking for permission to interact with the newcomer. "It's okay," Jake told the creature. "He's the one who brought you here. He's been taking care of you, even if his bedside manner needs work." With visible caution, the Voidstalker extended one not-quite hand toward Velkoth's tentacle. The moment they made contact, the creature began purring again, and Velkoth's expression shifted from terror to wonder to the sort of academic excitement that usually preceded the writing of very important papers. "Remarkable," Velkoth breathed. "It appears to be adopting pack inclusion behavior based on your social approval, Mr. Murphy. You've somehow established yourself as the alpha of a pack that includes multiple species." "Not alpha," Jake corrected gently, scratching the creature's chin while it made happy, rumbling sounds. "Partner. There's a difference. Alphas dominate through strength. Partners cooperate through mutual respect." He looked up at the assembled crowd of terrified students, armed security personnel, and one thoroughly confused professor. "That's probably why nobody's ever managed to study these guys before. You can't learn about someone by treating them like a problem to be solved. You have to treat them like a person you want to get to know." The Voidstalker, as if understanding the compliment, lifted its massive head and began very gently grooming Jake's hair, with a tongue the size of a small towel. Jake's hair immediately stood up in directions that defied several laws of physics, but he just laughed. "Good kitty," he said, and somehow, in that moment, it really was. 3 weeks later, Jake Murphy's official title had been upgraded from exchange student, provisional, to Special Consultant for Impossible Xenobiological Cases, Permanent, with hazard pay. The hazard pay wasn't because his job was dangerous, but because the Academy's insurance company had taken one look at his personnel file and immediately started drinking heavily. The Raxonian Void Stalker, who Jake had named Mr. Whiskers despite vehement protests from the Xenobiology department, had become the Galactic Academy's unofficial mascot. This had required some significant policy adjustments, including the installation of a custom habitat that was less luxury apartment for a very large cat who happened to be capable of ending civilizations. The habitat featured climbing structures made from decommissioned starship hulls, a swimming pool filled with a specialized liquid that mimicked the thermal vents of Raxon 7, and approximately 17 different types of scratching posts, ranging from reinforced titanium to compressed neutron star material for those really stubborn itches. Mr. Whiskers had expressed his approval of these accommodations by purring so loudly that nearby space traffic control had filed noise complaints. Professor Velkoth had undergone something of a career renaissance. His previous specialty of cataloging the various ways that alien creatures could murder you had evolved into groundbreaking research on interspecies communication and social psychology. His latest paper, Reconceptualizing Predator Behavior Through Non-Confrontational Interaction Protocols, had been downloaded more times than any xenobiology research in galactic history, largely because the abstract included the phrase belly rubs as a viable scientific methodology. He was currently standing in the Academy's main lecture hall, addressing an audience of researchers, military officials, and very confused insurance adjusters, with Jake sitting in the front row next to Mr. Whiskers, who had learned to sit quietly during presentations, as long as someone provided continuous ear scratches. As we have discovered through extensive field research, Velkoth announced, his tentacles gesturing toward a holographic display showing Jake's interaction protocols, approximately 73% of what we previously classified as incurably hostile species respond positively to what humans term being nice to them. This revelation had caused a significant upheaval in galactic military doctrine. Several species who had been maintaining expensive defense systems against implacably hostile neighbors had discovered that those neighbors were actually just lonely and perhaps a little cranky from centuries of isolation. The crystalline hegemony's first diplomatic contact with the Shadow Collective had ended with what observers described as the galaxy's most awkward but effective group hug. The human approach to xenobiology, Velkoth continued, appears to operate on the radical assumption that unknown species might be individuals with complex emotional needs rather than simply biological hazards to be contained or eliminated. He paused, looking down at Jake and Mr. Whiskers. This has proven to be disturbingly effective. Jake raised his hand. Quick question, Professor. Are you planning to cover the incident with the quantum parasites? Because that was really more about them needing adequate nutrition than wanting to devour reality. Yes, Mr. Murphy. We'll discuss your resolution of the quantum parasite crisis in next week's lecture. Velkoth's voice carried the long-suffering tone of someone whose career had become significantly more complicated since humans had joined the galactic community. For those who missed that particular incident, Mr. Murphy resolved a 17-year military standoff by determining that the quantum parasites were actually just very small and very hungry, and providing them with appropriate snacks caused them to stop attempting to consume local space-time. Commander Thex, who had been reassigned to head the Academy's new Department of Human-Assisted Crisis Resolution, stood up from the audience. "If I may add," he said, his voice carrying the tone of someone who had seen too much and learned to accept the impossible, Mr. Murphy's success rate with unsolvable hostile encounters now stands at 100%. This includes the Nebula Wraiths, who turned out to be depressed, the Void Krakens, who were apparently just bored, and the infamous Death Moon of Xerion, which was suffering from chronic insomnia. In my defense, Jake interjected, the Death Moon thing was pretty obvious once you realized it was actually a living creature. I mean, it kept trying to communicate by rearranging its crater patterns. That's classic nonverbal communication behavior. Mr. Whiskers made a supportive chirping sound and nuzzled Jake's shoulder, apparently agreeing with this assessment. The creature had developed quite strong opinions about proper scientific methodology and wasn't shy about expressing them. Which brings us, Velkoth announced, to the Academy's new mandatory curriculum requirements. Effective next semester, all xenobiology students will be required to complete courses in human interaction theory, emotional intelligence across species barriers, and advanced head-scratching techniques. The audience murmured appreciatively. The advanced head-scratching course had a waiting list 3 semesters long, largely because Jake's teaching methods had proven effective on everything from microscopic energy beings to planet-sized gas creatures who apparently enjoyed having their atmospheric layers gently ruffled. Furthermore, Velkoth continued, we are pleased to announce the opening of the Murphy Institute for Improbable Xenobiological Solutions, which will focus on developing peaceful contact protocols for species previously considered impossible to communicate with. Jake looked appropriately embarrassed by the honor, especially since Mr. Whiskers had chosen that moment to begin grooming his hair again, leaving him looking like he'd been styled by a tornado with good intentions. I still say we just need to approach every situation with basic respect and curiosity, Jake said, his voice slightly muffled by the massive tongue currently reorganizing his hairstyle. Most problems between species seem to come from everyone assuming the worst about each other instead of just asking, "Hey, what's going on? Can I help?" A student in the back row raised her hand. Mr. Murphy, what's your advice for students who want to follow your example but don't have your natural immunity to terror? Honestly? Jake grinned, finally managing to extract himself from Mr. Whiskers' enthusiastic grooming session. Start small, practice on regular animals first. Once you can make friends with a cranky cat or a nervous dog, scaling up to galactic apex predators is really just a matter of size adjustment. Mr. Whiskers purred his agreement, the sound reverberating through the lecture hall with enough force to make the chandeliers sway gently. Several students in the audience immediately began taking notes on purr frequency and harmonic resonance patterns. And remember, Jake added, scratching behind the creature's ears while it made sounds of contentment that registered on seismic equipment in the next star system, every monster is just someone nobody's bothered to get to know yet. Sometimes the scariest-looking creatures are the ones who need friends the most. As if to demonstrate this point, Mr. Whiskers flopped onto his side and began making the sort of happy rumbling sounds that suggested he had found his place in the universe, and it involved unlimited ear scratches from a human who thought he was beautiful exactly as he was. Professor Velkoth closed his presentation with a statement that would later be carved into the Academy's main entrance. As we have learned through Mr. Murphy's groundbreaking research, the universe is significantly less hostile and significantly more lonely than we previously believed. The solution, it appears, is simply to be kind. Jake Murphy, sitting in the front row of the galaxy's most prestigious academic institution, giving belly rubs to a creature that had previously been considered a force of nature, nodded approvingly. Yeah, he said softly, kindness works pretty well on everyone. Mr. Whiskers purred his agreement, and somehow that sound contained all the wisdom the galaxy would ever need.